The apartment lights were off when Cynthia, sleepless, absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone. A notification lost in the midst of updates caught her eye. A photo of her sister, Marianne, in a wedding dress. Cynthia's heart skipped a beat. The caption spoke of love, promises, and family, but none mentioned her name. Reality set in like a heavy weight. The wedding had already happened, and she hadn't even known it. Her first impulse was to deny it. Maybe it was a rehearsal. Maybe a postponed event. However, as she scrolled through the images, she saw the smiles of her relatives, her mother in a blue dress, and even the distant uncle she barely knew. Everyone was there, except her, the dogger who always solved everything, the dedicated nurse, the one who was always available. A familiar emptiness filled her chest, the kind of pain that doesn't bleed but gnaws. Cynthia dropped her cell phone on the sofa and took a deep breath, trying to contain the trembling in her hands. Her mind searched for a rational justification, but none seemed plausible. She felt like an intruder in her own family. The echo of the silence was more painful than any explanation they could offer. There, alone, she understood the weight of exclusion, not just of the event, but of history itself. Memories invaded without asking permission. She recalled the Christmases they'd shared, the laughter in the kitchen, the advice exchanged between sisters. Marianne had always been the dreamer, and she the protector. The contrast now seemed cruel. How could they have left her out on the most important day? Cynthia's throat tightened, and tears came without warning. She stood and looked at the reflection in the window. Tired eyes, disheveled hair, a hard expression. "Don't cry about it," she told herself, but her voice sounded too fragile to convince. The cold Bozeman wind blew through the crack in the window, bringing with it the loneliness of a woman who, for the first time, didn't know her place within her own family. In the following days, she avoided the subject. She feigned normalcy at work and ignored messages from acquaintances, but the wound throbbed with every mention of the wedding. Until one day, her mother called with her usual sweet voice, asking how she was. Cynthia responded automatically without mentioning the subject. When he hung up, the silence screamed louder than ever. It was then that something inside her broke. Not in despair, but in clarity. She needed answers. She needed to hear from them why. She grabbed her coat and keys and drove without thinking to the old family home, determined to demand what she deserved: respect and truth. The drive there seemed longer than I remembered. The snow-capped mountains reflected the frozen state of her heart. As she drove, the sun rose timidly over the horizon, but within her only darkness grew. As she parked in front of the house, the sound of the engine mingled with memories of times when that entrance had meant welcome. Now, it was the gateway to an emotional war. Cynthia took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the door, determined. When she knocked, her mother appeared surprised, her gaze torn between guilt and affection. "Cynthia, I didn't expect to see you," she said hesitantly. The answer came firmly. "Neither did I expect not to be invited to my sister's wedding. Imagine finding out that your own family left you out of such an important moment." If this story has already touched you, subscribe to the channel now. Here, each story makes you feel and rethink the true value of family ties. Dinner began in silence. The table, once synonymous with laughter and conversation, now felt like a minefield. The smell of fresh lasagna contrasted with the heavy atmosphere in the air. Elaine, trying to maintain her composure, chatted about trivialities, while Marianne kept her gaze lowered, stirring her food around her plate. Cynthia, for her part, watched everything with tense calm. Her sister's every move seemed rehearsed, her mother's every word carefully chosen. When she could bear it no longer, she put down her cutlery and asked directly, "Why wasn't I invited?"
The sound of the cutlery clattering echoed through the kitchen. Neither of them responded immediately. It was Mary Ann who broke the silence, her voice trembling. "We were afraid, Cynthia. Afraid that Dad would have an episode. You know how he is. And I didn't want it to become a spectacle." The words hung in the air, sharp. Cynthia blinked slowly, trying to process what she had heard. It wasn't envy. It wasn't distance. It was shame. The mother tried to intervene, justifying herself. "It was to avoid suffering. Your father isn't well, and we thought it would be too much for him. You always take charge of everything, and some people don't understand that. We wanted to avoid embarrassment." Cynthia let out a short, bitter laugh. "So they erased me from the family to avoid embarrassment?" Mary Ann wept silently. Elaine kept her gaze fixed on the table. Cynthia stood, her heart aching. "Do you think love is measured by how much we hide our imperfections? Dad isn't a burden. He's the reason I still believe in this family." Her tone was firm, but filled with suppressed pain. She walked to the door, feeling the cool night air against her face. For a moment, she considered looking back, but couldn't. The happy memories of that house seemed to have dissolved, along with the trust that she had placed in them. From inside, her mother called her name, but Cynthia had already made up her mind. From that moment on, she would no longer be responsible for fixing what others broke. She got in the car, started the engine, and drove off. The reflection of the house lights fading in the rearview mirror was like a silent goodbye. As he drove back to the cabin, the words echoed in her mind. Fear, shame, embarrassment. Everything she didn't feel for her father, but others seemed to carry. And it was there, between tears and the roar of the engine, that she realized maybe the problem hadn't been Hank at all, but what the family refused to face, the truth. The wind was blowing hard when Cynthia arrived at the cabin. Low clouds hid the mountaintops, and the chill seemed to penetrate even the thick coat she wore. The place, once synonymous with rest, now felt like a shelter from the world. As soon as she entered, the smell of wood and stale coffee enveloped her, and for a moment she could breathe, away from the lies and the shame of others. She dropped her bag on the floor and sat near the unlit fireplace. She looked around, noticing the signs of a life of voluntary solitude: stacked books, blankets draped over the sofa, old photographs of her father smiling in better days. In that stillness, memories came like waves, gentle at first, devastating later. She remembered the afternoons when Hank would teach her how to fix simple things, laughing at every mistake. "Nothing is lost if we have patience," he'd say. Now the phrase sounded ironic. Everything seemed lost, and patience was the last thing she had left. The echo of his voice filled the silence of the cabin like a sweet, aching ghost. Cynthia tried to distract herself. She made coffee, lit the stove, and turned on the old radio. An old country song began to play, reminding her of dancing with her father in the living room when she was a child. The memories came so strongly that she had to sit down, taking deep breaths to keep from collapsing. There was so much tenderness in Hank, and so much fear of what he was becoming. That night, she wrote in the notebook she always carried, "They took me out of the marriage, but they can't take away the love I have for my dad. I just don't know what to do with him anymore." The words seemed to come to life on the paper, as if the pain, when written, transformed into something less suffocating. Days passed, and Cynthia grew accustomed to the isolation. She worked from home, tended the garden, and tried not to think too much. But her mind kept returning to dinner, her sister's tears, her mother's guilty look. None of them were villains, and perhaps that was what hurt the most. One morning, she received an unexpected call. Her mother, in a weary voice, said her father had had another episode.
"He asked about you," Elaine murmured brokenly. Cintia remained silent, the phone freezing between her fingers. She couldn't decide whether to feel strength or weakness upon hearing that. The road to her parents' house seemed endless. The wind blew against the car as if trying to stop her from going back. But something inside her knew she couldn't hide forever. Pain only changes shape when we face it. As she parked, she saw the living room curtain move, a familiar figure, an ancient presence. Hank was still there, even if his mind was no longer fully there. And in that moment, between fear and tenderness, Cintia felt the first stirring of forgiveness. She got out of the car slowly, as if stepping on broken glass. She knew the reunion would be painful, but she also knew she needed him as much as the cold air she breathed. Her father sat in the armchair, his gaze lost somewhere in the void. The clock on the wall marked time cruelly, each tick a reminder of human frailty. Cintia entered silently, studying his face, aged but still familiar. Her hands trembled slightly on the plaid blanket. "Hank?" she called softly, avoiding the word "Dad," as if the word might scare him. He turned his head, taking a few seconds to react. "Mary?" he asked, mistaking her for his mother. The sound of the wrong name hit her like a dull blow, but she smiled. "No, it's me, Cintia." He blinked slowly, confused, and replied, "You've grown so much." That simple sentence made her collapse inside. She sat beside him and held his cold hand. His rough skin, his prominent veins, every detail was a vivid reminder of the man who had taught her strength, and now he felt like a frightened child in a tired body. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they'd never said. She began talking about the weather, the cabin, small things, trying to summon some memory. Every now and then he smiled, as if a spark of remembrance had appeared, but it quickly faded, and each time Cintia felt a piece of her own soul melt away. When Elaine entered the room, the smell of hot soup filled the room. "He's had a rough day," her mother said, not looking directly at her daughter. Cintia simply nodded. The tension was still there, but in that moment, they both seemed united by helplessness. Seeing Hank like this was something neither of them knew how to handle. Throughout the night, Cintia lay awake beside him. The sound of crickets outside mingled with her father's ragged breathing. Sometimes he murmured disjointed words, names, distorted memories, apologies. Cintia jotted some down in her notebook, trying to make sense of the confusion. In a rare moment of lucidity, Hank took her hand and said, "You've always been my courage, girl." That was all. Then he returned to silence. The tears came, but this time without despair. They were tears of pure love, of silent farewell. As the sun rose, Cintia looked at her sleeping father and knew she could run no further. His illness wasn't just a tragedy, it was a calling, a request for her to look within and decide what caring truly meant.
She left the room and found her mother making coffee. "I'll stay here for a while, if you want," Cintia said, almost in a whisper. Elaine looked up, surprised and relieved. "Thank you, daughter." It was the first time in a long time that those words, daughter, rang true. The house seemed quieter since Cynthia's last visit. The phone rang one night, interrupting the sound of the wind rattling the cabin windows. On the other end, her mother's voice was low and tired. "Cynthia, I need help. Your father hasn't slept in 2 days. He's confused, and I don't know what to do." Her heart pounded. For a moment, she considered refusing, but instinct won out. Hours later, she was on the road, her headlights illuminating the freshly fallen snow. The loneliness of the journey reflected the emotional distance that still lingered between her and her mother. In the passenger seat was a small suitcase filled with clothes and medicine. "This time, I'm not coming back to fix anyone," she murmured, like an oath. "I'll come back for him." When she arrived, she found Elaine with dark circles under her eyes and a lost look in her eyes. "He doesn't want to eat, and he mistook the bathroom for his bedroom," her mother explained, her voice breaking. Cintia surveyed the room and noticed the chaos, piled up dishes, scattered medicines, and a smell of neglect. There was no criticism in her gaze, only compassion. Entering the room, she saw her father lying there, restless. "Daddy?" she whispered, this time using the full word. He opened his eyes and smiled, as if recognizing her. "My girl, you're back." That was enough. All the hurt, the resentment, the coldness dissolved for an instant. She sat beside him and promised she would stay. In the following days, Cintia took charge of the routine. She organized medications, adjusted schedules, cleaned the house, and restored some order. Elaine watched it all with a mixture of relief and guilt. It was clear that a wall still existed between them, but caring for Hank created small gaps through which humanity could once again penetrate. One cold afternoon, while her father slept, Elaine entered the living room and sat quietly. "I know what you think of me," she said, staring into her teacup. "But I only tried to protect everyone, including you." Cintia took a deep breath before answering. "Mommy, sometimes protecting is just a pretty way of hiding fear." The conversation ended there, but the words hung in the air like smoke. They weren't ready to forgive each other yet, but for the first time, they could hear each other without shouting. It was progress, small, but real. That night, Cintia watched her father sleep. His face was peaceful, and the sound of his breathing was rhythmic. An unexpected feeling overcame her. Gratitude. Despite everything, they still had time. Time to care. Time to try to fix what could be fixed.
As she turned off the living room lights, she glanced down the hallway and saw her mother standing in the bedroom doorway, watching Hank tenderly. It was as if, for a moment, the entire past had been summed up in that simple gesture. Love disguised as fear, still trying to survive. Routine became a cycle of fragile repetitions. In the morning, Hank would wake up confused and ask about the school schedule he no longer had. In the afternoon, he thought he was getting ready for a trip. At night, he sometimes recognized Cintia, sometimes called her the girl from the neighborhood. Each day was a new challenge between the present and the past. Cintia began keeping a journal about her father's reactions, trying to find patterns. But gradually, she realized it wasn't just a medical record. It was a way to stay emotionally stable. Each written word served as an anchor for what sanity remained within her. One morning, Hank insisted on leaving to pick up the girls from school. Cintia walked him to the gate and held his hand. "We're home now, Daddy. Mary Ann and I are grown. School's over." He looked at her with a confused expression, then smiled. "Then I did a good job." Her heart sank. It was a flash of clarity, brief but precious. That afternoon, while cleaning her room, Cintia found a dusty old album. Inside were photos of birthdays, picnics, and Christmases. In each image, Hank appeared with the same proud look. Leafing through, she found a photo of Mary Ann dressed as a bride, a memory of an old dream, long before the royal wedding. She smiled bitterly. Time sometimes mocked coincidences. In another box, she found yellowed letters, some addressed to Elaine, others to no one in particular. One stood out, "To my girls, in case I forget." The handwriting was shaky but recognizable. Cintia opened it with trembling hands and read, "If one day I don't remember who you are, remember who you've always been to me, my reason." The tears fell unabated.
She tucked the letter into her pocket and stepped outside to breathe the chilly air of the yard. The mountain in the distance seemed to watch silently. There in that moment, Cintia understood that dementia wasn't taking her father away all at once. It was just teaching him to say goodbye little by little. That night, Elaine sat with her on the porch. "He listens to you more than he listens to me," she confessed. "He always has," Cintia replied without looking, "because I always wanted to listen to him too." It was the most honest conversation they'd had in years. When they returned inside, Hank was awake, watching them with a half-smile. "My girls, are you fighting again?" he asked. They looked at each other and laughed, tears in their eyes. The chorus answered, "Not this time, Daddy." Later, alone, Cintia wrote in her diary, "Today, time stopped for a few minutes, and for the first time, it didn't hurt."
The sun was streaming through the kitchen window when Marianne appeared unannounced. The doorbell rang timidly, but enough to make Cintia shiver. It was the first time they'd seen each other since the confession dinner. When she opened the door, the silence between them was more eloquent than any words. Marianne held flowers and a cake, as if small gestures could mend broken hearts. "Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly. Cintia simply nodded. The house smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and her father was asleep in the living room, wrapped in blankets. Marianne looked at him with tenderness and guilt in her eyes. "He looks so fragile," she murmured. Cintia replied calmly, but firmly. "He's still strong. He's just fighting in a different way." As they drank coffee, the conversation stumbled with long pauses. Marianne tried to bring up light topics, but the weight of what was left unsaid was in every look. Until, unable to bear it any longer, she lowered her head and said, "I tried to convince Mom to invite you. I swear, but she said it would be better this way, and I didn't want to argue. I failed you, Cintia." The words hung in the air, between regret and relief. Cintia watched her sister, so different from her, yet equally wounded. "You weren't the one supposed to protect me, Mari. I just wish someone had had the courage to tell the truth." Marianne wept softly. "I thought I was sparing you." "No, you were sparing everyone's fear." They hugged for the first time in months. It was an awkward embrace, full of tears and memories. The hurt didn't disappear, but it softened. Cintia felt that perhaps forgiving was simply allowing the other person to try again. Forgiveness, after all, wasn't a period, it was a comma. Later, the two went out into the backyard, where the cool wind played through the dry leaves. Marianne said the wedding had been beautiful, but that she hadn't felt complete. She confessed, "I was missing you and Dad." Cintia held her hand. "Not anymore." Meanwhile, inside the house, Hank was waking up. Seeing his daughters through the window, he tried to call out to them, but his voice was weak. Still, he smiled. In the confusion of his mind, he might not even know why, but he felt something good was happening, and that was enough. That night, before going to sleep, Cintia wrote, "Today I discovered that a sister's love doesn't disappear. It only hides when the pain speaks louder. And today the silence of pain was less than the desire to start over." It was Sunday when Cintia decided to reorganize her father's room. The air was thick with dust and old memories. Each drawer revealed fragments of a life, school reports, faded photos, notes scribbled on loose paper. At the bottom of one box, she found something unusual, a brown-covered notebook tied with a frayed ribbon.
Upon opening it, she realized it wasn't a simple diary. The first pages contained to-do lists, then short texts, jumbled memories, and short phrases like, Today she smiled, or not remembering hurts. Cynthia's heart sank. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. It was her father's voice recorded on the paper, trying to keep his own identity alive. Further on, a page caught her eye. "The wedding will be beautiful, but I don't want to go. I don't want them to see me like this. I don't want my girls to remember me like this." Cintia read and reread the words, unable to contain her tears. That changed everything. He hadn't been excluded. He had chosen not to go. And his family, trying to respect his request, ended up hurting her heart. She sat on the floor, hugging her notebook, feeling the weight of the revelations. For months, she had carried anger and pain, and now everything was rewritten in new layers of understanding. Her father's love was there, in the scribbled pages and the silent fear of being a burden. It was love disguised as surrender. Marianne entered the room and found her crying. "What happened?" she asked worriedly. Cintia showed her the notebook. Marianne flipped through the pages and put her hand to her mouth. "My God, he asked not to go." Her voice was a whisper. The two looked at each other, tears and relief mingling. For the first time, they understood there was no one to blame, just people trying to cope with their pain however they could. That night, they showed Elaine the notebook. Her mother was silent for a long time, holding the pages as if they were relics. "He told me he wanted to protect you," she whispered. "But I never imagined he wrote everything down." Tears flowed silently, wetting the paper. Cintia closed her notebook and said firmly, "I think it's time we stopped hiding what we feel. Dad didn't want shame to be his legacy." Elaine nodded, overcome with emotion. Marianne held both their hands, and for the first time in a long time, the trio felt like a family again. Later, Cintia placed the notebook on the living room table next to the photo of her young father, smiling with his young daughters on his lap. The fire in the fireplace reflected off the frames, as if time had bent for a moment to embrace them. Before going to sleep, she wrote in her diary, "Forgiveness is a blank page. Today I decided to start writing again." The next morning, Cintia woke with a strange lightness, as if the air in the house had changed. The sun streamed through the curtains, illuminating her father's notebook on the table. For a moment, she considered continuing to read, but decided to leave it there, as if the silence between the pages were more powerful than any revelation. It was the silence of forgiveness beginning to dawn. She stepped onto the balcony and breathed in the cool air. Marianne slept on the living room couch, and Elaine was making coffee in the kitchen. The smell of bread and butter mingled with the soft sound of the radio. It was all so ordinary, yet so rare. It had been years since they had experienced a simple moment without accusations, simply coexisting. Cintia realized that forgiveness wasn't some grandiose scene. It was this, everyday life becoming possible again.
Later, while washing the dishes, she heard her mother comment to Marianne, "I never imagined he would write so much. It was his way of loving us silently." Cintia pretended not to hear, but the words sank deep. She understood then that perhaps everyone was just trying to love with the tools they had, even if sometimes those tools cut rather than repair. His father woke later, his eyes wide and his speech slurred. Cintia helped him up and led him to the window. He stared at the garden for a few minutes, as if searching for something familiar. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. Hank nodded slowly. "It always was, only now it seems different." It felt like a mirror of his own life, the same landscape, but a new perspective. That afternoon, Marianne suggested making Hank's favorite dinner, roast beef and mashed potatoes.
The three of them cooked together, and the atmosphere filled with memories. Amid laughter and tears, Cintia realized something had changed in them. Guilt still lingered, but it was transforming into care. It was as if love, after so much pain, had finally found a softer tone. After dinner, Cintia returned to reading passages from her notebook. One of them read, "If one day I forget who you are, I hope you don't forget who I was. I was a father, and I loved the best I could." The words pierced her chest like a prayer. She no longer needed to seek justification. She already had what she needed: understanding. That night, he wrote in his diary, "Forgiving is not absolving the other person. It's letting go of the burden alone." Before going to sleep, he looked at his father, who was resting peacefully, and realized that perhaps this was the true beginning again. Not the spoken forgiveness, but the lived one, in silent gestures. And when he turned out the light, he felt, for the first time in a long time, at peace. The snow was beginning to melt when Marianne announced she was returning home. Cintia pretended not to care, but her heart sank. In the last few days, they had grown so close that the thought of distance seemed painful. "You know where to find me," Marianne said, trying to hide her tears. "Now I know," Cintia replied with a restrained smile. The house fell silent after their departure. The sound of Marianne's footsteps echoed in memory, along with her shy laughter, the smell of morning coffee. It was strange to miss someone who, for so long, had been merely an absent presence. Her absence was now full, filled with meaning and reconciliation. Cintia fell back into her routine. She cared for her father, read to him, and noted the day's small victories. A smile, a memory, a coherent sentence. Hank seemed calmer. Sometimes he looked at her tenderly, as if he still recognized her daughter, even if he no longer knew her name. And that was enough.
One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Marianne. Inside was a wedding photo, not the one Cintia had seen on social media, but a new, printed, and dedicated one. On the back, it read, "You were missing. Now this picture is complete." The tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink a little, but not the meaning. It was forgiveness taking physical form. That same night, Elaine invited Cintia over for dinner. "You know, when you were little, you said you wanted to be a nurse to fix people. I guess in a way you succeeded," her mother said with a sad smile. Cintia replied, "I've learned that not everything can be fixed. Some things we just learn to handle more carefully." The phone rang. It was Marianne. They talked about their father, about the weather, about little things. They laughed about old memories, and when they hung up, Cintia felt a warmth in her chest. The bond, so fragile, now seemed strong enough to withstand the distance. After dinner, she went out into the backyard and looked up at the clear sky. The cold bit her skin, but her heart was warm. The distant sound of the wind seemed to whisper her father's words, the ones from the notebook. "Nothing is lost if we have patience." She smiled to herself, imagining that maybe he was still right. Love, that complicated, imperfect love, was still there, breathing. When he returned, he saw the notebook open on the table, one page turned by the wind. On it, a sentence he had never noticed before. "One day they will forgive each other, and when that happens, I will be at peace." She ran her hand over the page, carefully closed the notebook, and whispered, "You can rest easy, Daddy. We're getting there." The sky began to darken early that day. Heavy clouds heralded a storm from the north, and the cold wind blew against the windows with increasing force. Cintia was in her father's room changing the sheets when the lights flickered for the first time. "Looks like the weather is about to change," she remarked, more to herself than to Hank, who was watching the ceiling with a distant gaze. A few minutes later, the sound of thunder shook the house, and the power went out. It was pitch black, interrupted only by the occasional lightning. Cintia grabbed a flashlight and lit candles in the living room. The sound of the wind and rain against the roof made it feel like the world outside was collapsing. Elaine appeared in the kitchen, distressed, and asked if everything was okay. "It'll pass soon," Cintia replied, trying to sound confident. But something was wrong. Hank stood up suddenly, mumbling incoherently. "They're alone. I have to pick them up from school. It's late," he said, grabbing his coat and walking toward the door. Cintia intercepted him, holding him by the shoulders. "Daddy, calm down. We're here. Marianne and I are grown up." He looked at her blankly, breathless, his eyes watering. "I can't leave my girls alone."
The scene tore at Cynthia's heart. She tried to calm him, speaking softly, holding his hand, while Elaine watched, paralyzed between fear and remorse. "Look at me, Daddy," Cynthia pleaded. "You did it. We're safe. You already took care of us." For a moment, he seemed to hear her. His hands trembled less. "Did I take good care of you?" he asked, his voice weak, almost childish. "Better than anyone," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. The storm raged outside, but inside the house, time seemed suspended. Hank wept silently, and Cynthia held him, feeling his body tremble with exhaustion. Elaine approached slowly, placing a blanket over them both. "He just wants to continue being a father," she whispered. Cynthia nodded, still holding him. "And I just want to continue being a daughter." Later, when the storm had subsided, Marianne arrived, hurried and drenched in rain. Entering, she saw her father sleeping on the couch, exhausted, and her sister beside her, her eyes swollen. "What happened?" she asked. Cynthia replied softly, "He just wanted to pick us up from school." Her mother nodded, her eyes welling up. "Your father was always afraid he wouldn't be around when you needed him. I guess, in a way, that fear never went away." The two of them were silent for a few seconds, listening to the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. After so long avoiding difficult conversations, Cynthia sat at the table and looked at Elaine. "Mommy, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you regret what you did, hiding the marriage, trying to push me away?" Elaine sighed, resting her hands in her lap. "Every day, but not for the reason you think. I thought I was protecting you. I just didn't realize I hurt you even more." The words came as a relief, and also as a reopened wound. "I needed you to trust me, Mom, not to protect me from everything." Elaine nodded, tears in her eyes. "I never knew how to be weak in front of you. I always wanted to appear strong, but deep down, I was also afraid." Her voice trembled, revealing years of stored weight. Cintia reached out and took her hand. "We still have time to make things right." Elaine smiled through her tears. "You've always been stronger than me, daughter." For once, Cintia didn't refuse the compliment. She simply replied, "No, I just learned to break without making a sound." Their father woke, calling their names. As they approached, he smiled sweetly. "My girls, are they finally getting along?" They both laughed, their eyes filling with tears. "Yes, Daddy, finally." During lunch, the mood was different. The laughter returned, light and spontaneous. Elaine told old stories from when Hank was still teaching, and Cintia and Mariana laughed at every forgotten detail. It was as if time had given a brief respite, allowing the past and present to touch again. Later, as the sun began to set, Cintia walked alone into the backyard. The cool wind brought a pleasant, almost liberating shiver. She looked up at the sky and thought about how sometimes the greatest healing comes from the longest silences. That night,
she wrote in her diary, "Today, I forgave my mother. Not because she asked, but because I finally understood. Winter was beginning to break, and the morning air carried a lighter, almost hopeful chill. Cintia woke to the soft sound of birds, a rarity in the region. She slowly descended the stairs and found Hank sitting at the table, staring out the window. His coffee cup was still steaming beside him. "Good morning, Dad," she said, smiling. He turned his face away, and for a moment his gaze seemed blank. Then, like a spark lighting a candle, lucidity returned. "Cintia," he asked, his voice firm and the tone of someone who truly knew what he was saying. She swallowed and replied, almost voiceless, "Yes, it's me." He smiled, a serene, tired, but full of affection. "You stayed. I knew you would." Those words pierced her heart like a hug. "I always will, Daddy," she replied, her tears held back. For a few minutes, time stood still. They talked about old memories, the first day of school, campfire stories, childhood summer fishing trips. He recalled every detail as if the past had been carefully stored for that moment. Cintia listened to him as if trying to memorize every word before the silence returned. When Elaine appeared, she noticed the sparkle in his eyes and brought her hand to her mouth, overcome with emotion. "Do you remember us?" she asked. Hank nodded and took her hand. "How could I forget the love of my life?" His mother wept softly, sitting beside him. The scene was simple, but there was something sacred about it, a small gift of time, granted before goodbye.
Later, Marianne arrived to find her father laughing over old stories. "Look, my girls all together," he said, his voice firm, his face glowing. The three of them sat around him, just as they had when they were children. For a moment, it seemed as if the illness had receded, granting one last gift, the memory of the love that had always united them. As the sun set, Cintia helped him lie down. He held her hand and whispered, "Promise you'll live, even when I forget to remind you." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I promise, Daddy." He closed his eyes, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That night, he slept soundly, and the silence that spread through the house wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Cintia watched her father for long minutes, recording every feature, every wrinkle, every sigh. In his diary he wrote, "Today, time gave back what illness stole, and for an instant, my father was whole again." The following days passed slowly, as if the world had slowed down out of respect for the serenity that had settled in. Hank slept more, spoke less, but seemed peaceful. The three women, now united, took turns caring for him. The routine that had once been a burden was now one of affection, silence, and small daily victories. Marianne came every weekend, helping with the chores and bringing joy with her light-hearted presence. "You're different, Cintia," she said one afternoon, as they washed dishes together. "More calm. Before, it seemed like you were carrying the world on your shoulders." Cintia smiled. "Maybe I've learned to put the world down every now and then." Elaine had changed too. She was no longer the woman who avoided talking about her feelings. Now she embraced unhurriedly, apologized when she made a mistake, and listened without interrupting. Her pain had turned to wisdom. Sometimes, as she watched her daughters care for her husband, she thought that, despite all her mistakes, perhaps she had still done something right. Hank, even in moments of confusion, seemed to sense his new equilibrium. Sometimes he called Marianne teacher, Cintia mom, and Elaine my girl. No one corrected him. They learned that in his fragility there was a greater truth. Love doesn't have to be right to be real. One morning, Cintia woke up to find her mother sitting at the table reading Hank's notebook. "You know what I realized?"
Elaine said, her eyes welling up. He didn't write about the fear of dying, but about the fear of being forgotten. And in a way, he overcame that fear. We will never forget him. Cintia took her hand and nodded. Or what he taught us about love. Life resumed its gentle rhythm. The garden bloomed, the smell of coffee filled the mornings again, and even silence took on a different sound. The sound of presence, not absence. Marianne played with her father, Elaine sewed, and Cintia wrote.
One late afternoon, as the sun gilded the mountains, Cintia surveyed the scene and realized that something inside her had finally settled. The guilt, the anger, the fear, everything had given way to gratitude. I think that's what he wanted, she thought, for us to learn to stay. That night she wrote, "Not every ending is a loss. Sometimes it's just love changing shape to continue existing." Autumn arrived silently, dyeing the trees golden. The house smelled of cinnamon and burning wood. It was a quiet morning when Cintia noticed her father had been sleeping longer than usual. She approached the bed and called his name softly, "Daddy?" But there was no response. His face was serene, his lips slightly curved in a smile. A moment of silence was enough to understand he had finally rested. She stood there, holding his hand, without tears, without despair, just an immense emptiness that, paradoxically, was filled with love. Marianne arrived soon after, and when her sister told her, they hugged tightly. Elaine came in next, her eyes brimming with tears, and sat beside her husband. "He waited for a nice day to go," she said calmly. It was true. Outside, the sun shone with an unusual sweetness. The following days were slow, filled with visits, flowers, and memories. The grief came in waves, but it was a pure grief, without regrets. Cintia handled the funeral details with serenity. There was no burden of obligations, only the desire to honor the life of someone who had taught them the meaning of presence. At the ceremony, everyone who had once been separated was there. Friends, former neighbors, even Hank's students. When Cintia rose to speak, the hall was completely silent. "My father taught me that love doesn't need recognition to exist. Today, I understand that caring is also a form of love, and that memory is love's way of continuing to breathe." The words floated through the air like a collective hug. After the burial, the three of them returned home. The silence was different now, not the silence of absence, but of plenitude. Late in the afternoon, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset tint the mountains. Marianne rested her head on Cynthia's shoulder, and Elaine held their hands. "He's here," their mother said, gazing at the horizon. "He'll always be." A few months later, life resumed its course. Cintia decided to write a book about her father. Not a biography, but a story about love, memory, and reconciliation. She called it Between Oblivion and Forgiveness. Every word was a way to keep him alive, to transform pain into something beautiful. One cold afternoon, as she wrote the final chapter, she looked out the window. The wind rustled the leaves, and the sun filtered through in orange hues. A feeling of peace enveloped her. She picked up Hank's old notebook and opened it to the last page, where he had written, "When I forget, remember for me." Cintia smiled tenderly and replied softly, "I remember for both of us, Dad." She closed the notebook, placed it on the book's manuscript, and took a deep breath. Outside, the day was ending slowly, unhurriedly, as if time, out of respect, was waiting for her to say goodbye.
In the last line of his new diary, he wrote, "Not every absence is a loss. Sometimes it's just love's way of staying by our side." We spend our lives trying to understand love, until we realize
It was always there, just changing form. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now and continue living moments like this with me, because some stories aren't just told, they're felt.